Hello, and welcome to Writers Group Therapy.
I'm Tom.
And I'm Roshni. We're writers helping writers with whatever writing ailments you might have.
Whether it's related to your craft or your career, we can help.
Are you ready for your session?
The
The doctors
doctors
are
are
in.
in. On this session of Writers Group Therapy, we have with us all the way from New Zealand, writer-director Christine Jeffs, to talk about her new medical drama, A Mistake, starring Elizabeth Banks. Previously, Christine directed Amy Adams and Emily Blunt in Sunshine Cleaning and Gwyneth Paltrow in Sylvia. A Mistake was adapted by Christine from the Carl Shaker novel of the same name and deals with the repercussions of one small mistake during a surgery on a very sick young woman and how the doctors, hospital, and family involved deal with them. Welcome to the show, Christine.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Oh, well, we're very glad to have you here. It's so funny because we're in like three very different time zones right now. It's like afternoon for Roshni. I'm in the evening, and you're like tomorrow morning. So
Outer space.
it's great. It's wonderful. I think you might be one of our most distant interviews so far. Let's get started. A Mistake is out in theaters now, but before we get into the film, let's back up a little bit and talk about your journey. You were not initially a writer or a director, right? You were on the editing team, correct?
That is correct.
How
So,
did you start that, and then how did it lead to you writing?
oh goodness me, we have such a varied path on our journeys to end up where we are and how we're doing things. And I at university, I did a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology and Geography, and I was very interested in those kind of topics. And then I really was quite kind of visually orientated, and I really wanted to get into something creative. And like many young people, I didn't know what. And I started working in film sound first, actually, in a place that did sound transfers and mixing for feature films and things like that. And I was so interested in the techniques associated with filmmaking. I wanted to learn as much as I could about running the machinery of it, like what went on in the post production area and things like that. So I started first in film sound, and I found my way around that, assisting in the mixes of feature films and so on and so forth, and doing sound transfers and being in the recording studio. And I loved that. And then I found an opportunity to get into editing. So I became an assistant film editor on feature films and documentaries, and that's very much like being a librarian filing all the film trims, because it was in the days of film and on 16 mil or 35 mil. And so I learnt that craft of editing. And the amazing thing about being in an editing room is you see so much performance and the little details that go into crafting both the story and the journey of the characters and things like that. So then I did that for about 10 years. And I then went to the Australian Film, Television, Radio School, which is the school made famous by Jane Campion in Sydney, Australia. And I did a postgraduate diploma in film editing, where we just edited on film all day, every day. I had my own editing room in Steenbeck, which is the big editing machine, and edited
Yeah.
films. And I was immersed in a culture of, there was an amazing library with some video cassettes that you could get out on those days. And so I immersed myself in some, the excitement of, having access to amazing movies. And there was a dark room where I did some photography, and I was just so into the craft of editing. I just loved it. And then that led me, my passion for film editing led me to write my first uh, film, which was the short film. And I wrote that and directed it purely for the joy of the craft of bringing the images together. And I edited that on 35 millimeter film, and it had lots of optical effects and so on and so forth. And that was a quite an operatic visual piece, which was quite outlandish, about a woman who was swimming in a public swimming pool and then became sort of surrounded by a very serious male team who were training, and it turned into a chaotic and humorous kind of event where she got tangled up in them. So there was lots of underwater photography and sort of
Oh,
step
wow.
printing and all that kind of stuff. And that film went to the Cannes Film Festival, which was my entree into sort of taking my work out.
Started with just a small festival, right?
Yeah.
That is impressive. Yeah.
So that, and then I actually was editing that film in the edit on the Steenbeck in the edit room in a commercial house. They kindly lent me their Steenbeck, and they said, "Oh, do you want to come and do some work?" And I had been editing some commercials on film in those days. That's how they were edited. And I said, "Oh yeah, sure." But they actually meant for me to start directing, so I did that for about 20 years. And yeah, that sort of uh, taught me lots and lots of stuff. And then I was very passionate about trying to tell a bigger story. And that's how my first feature film came about. And that was called Rain. And,
Right. Yeah.
and that went to Cannes again in Director's Fortnight in 2001, I think it was.
Now, Rain, that wasn't an adaptation, was it? That was an original.
Yes, it was an adaptation
Oh, it was.
of the
So
Kirsty
you've done
Young book.
three feature adaptations then so far.
Um, two, two. Although I mean, I have done one that didn't see the light of day.
Ah,
Not every project gets to see the light of day, but yes. So I've done Rain, which I directed, and A Mistake, the two adaptations. Yeah,
oh, that's right. Because Sunshine Cleaning, you were just directing.
correct. Yeah,
Ah, yes, cool. That was a great film too.
thank.
As you move from editing to directing to writing, I mean, it's kind of funny because it's like you almost went backwards in the production cycle, from post production to production to pre production. So the
Yeah.
writing, writing is usually what happens first, then the production, the directing, and then the editing. So how do you think that helped you when you started to do when you were writing and writing your features and doing your adaptations? How do you think that helped you working backwards that way, sort of?
Well, I think I had the advantage of having seen a lot of other people's rushes, work in progress, and the refinement of that through the editing process. And I think also it made me really want to find my own stories or other people's stories that I was attracted to adapt. It made me really kind of be passionate about wanting to sort of make my own film, I think. So you have such an amazing contribution when you're editing. I think in terms of the advantage of having spent many years in edit rooms is I really, as an editor or as an assistant editor, you're at the service of the vision of the director and telling their story. And I got really excited about the idea of perhaps delving into telling my own stories. So it sort of opened my eyes to the excitement of what it would mean to be able to be sitting beside the editor, but not being the editor yourself necessarily, in a different way. So yeah.
I mean, for A Mistake, you wore a lot of hats. I think you wore everything but editor. Actually, on this one, you wrote it, you directed it, and you produced it. So, what did you find because of your background and because you were wearing all those hats? How did it make it easier to do the film? And then, what challenges did you face because you were doing so much?
Well, I guess all the different hats I wore were compartmentalized because the writing was sort of the writing, and I was able to support that by my vision as a director. And and actually, I did take an editing credit. My editor Paul Maxwell insisted that I share the credit because I was so there every day, and so it was so important about the way it was edited and how it went together to me, and I love that process. So I actually wore that hat as well. Um, and then I think one of the things that's great about wearing that particular hat is you're able to really lead the storytelling. And I think probably as a filmmaker, although film is so collaborative, and you're sort of blessed by having all these great people around you, but also sometimes you just have to be quite singular in your vision to get a particular version of the story out. And because this is a independent film, I felt very supported by the rest of the team to be able to fulfill my vision for the film.
So, A Mistake was adapted from the book. When you were working on it, how did you decide what to keep, what to throw out, what to tweak? Is it pretty close one on one with the book?
That's such a good question. It's it has a lot of well, firstly, I should say that Carl Schukker's book is so intense and so amazing, and how it tells the story of the surgeon who's fallible and everything that unravels from a mistaken surgery. And I did make some quite key differences in the adaptation. And I guess with any story, you have to, for me, it's not purely a technical exercise, but it's an exercise in storytelling. So I always ask myself, what can I bring to this from my own experience in the world? Like, why would I tell the story? Why would I choose to tell the story? And what part of it would I want to amplify, and why? So those are the kinds of questions that I ask myself, or did ask myself going into a mistake, but would ask myself um, on any project. And so I had Carl's book as a Bible, and then I asked myself, gosh, I think this is what I really want to focus on. And essentially, I wanted the story of the family to take more precedence, and for that to reverberate through the story. So there's many original
Hmm.
sequences and scenes in the film that were not in the novel, and likewise, there's many structural sequences in the novel that are not in the screenplay. And I think Carl is like hugely experienced he used to be um, the editor of the British Medical Journal, so he's so well researched in the medical world and really knows his stuff. And I had to kind of really go, what relationships do I want to expand, or do I want to focus on, and what's the journey of our key character, and how do I want to explore this through this filmmaking opportunity? So those are the kinds of questions I asked myself. So there were quite big differences, and I think also there's a lot of cerebral elements in the novel. So although the film has a lot of medical jargon and so on, um, it's very real, but it's also um, I have also chosen to amplify some of the relationships in particular.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's a like 95% emotional movie. The medical stuff does not get in the way of the emotions at all, and it's really about the characters and the ordeals they're going through. And it's also, I think, one of the best things about the movie I like is that you really do a great job of they say show don't tell, and there's a lots of the actors really did a great job of portraying the anxiety and stress and frustration that they're going through during the film. So, you did a great job as a director bringing that out of them and using it to tell the story without having too much, exposition and dialogue. It's really done very well in that respect.
Thank you.
So how did you approach that part of it? Like I haven't seen the script on paper, so I'm imagining it's a lot of description and there's not a lot of white space actually.
Well, it's interesting. I'd have to grab the script and have a look. It's close by somewhere, but um, I think the thing is I always knew that it was the spaces in between the dialogue that were also important. And and sometimes you have to fight for that. And I also think it was very important to me that the audience experience some of what the characters are going through. And a great example of that is the grieving parents in the whānau room scene where Elizabeth goes to talk to them about what happened during the surgery. And I made some choices in the writing and also in the editorial that the audience would sit there with them. But so before Elizabeth comes in, we have to be present with their grief. And some of that is quite unusual, I think, but that's quite deliberate because there's such a beating heart of the story, but are only there a couple of times in the screenplay. And I wanted to make choices that would hopefully allow those characters and the ramifications of what's gone on in that room to resonate so that later on we know that we have a funny feeling like a shift that there's a shift that we feel where we're like, oh, this is going to come back. I don't think we're done with this yet. So that creates something you can't put your finger on. So when the father sort of says, "What's your name again?" to the surgeon, and
Mm-hmm.
he takes a photograph and he lifts up the phone and he takes that photograph of her, and she tells him her name, and then he takes his photograph, and I never cut back to Elizabeth, and that's because I wanted him to keep the power in the scene. So there's a lot of
Mm.
choices like that where we're just observing and feeling, and there's sort of tension carried on. But yeah, so those are choices you make in your directing, but also, you know,
Yeah, it's an interesting film because, and not to be a little tiny bit spoilerish here, there's this movie doesn't have any winners. There's no, you're not like rooting for, you're trying to root for someone, but there's really, it's not a situation where somebody wins and somebody loses.
yeah.
I mean, it definitely has some consequences, but you know what I mean? It's not like, it's not the kind of movie you leave feeling hugely cathartic about.
Mm,
It's definitely more of a thinking film when you leave the theater.
yes. Yes, I would agree with that. And I hope that it is a conversation starter. And I've heard that there's been a lot of talking afterwards, like people want to go, hang on a minute, I thought this. What did you think? So there's that kind of conversation going on. And I think perhaps it's one of the themes of the film is it's because it's not a procedural, it's about a mistake, but we don't unpack that mistake because there's one mistake after another, and some of the mistakes are in the nuances of how we are with each other. So when she talks with her registrar and her junior surgeon, and it's he finds out that the girl has died, she leaves him hanging. She doesn't really give him emotionally what he needs in that moment because her attitude is, he's got to learn to love the hook. That's what she says later on in the film. And so I think one of the things about the nuanced nature of the storytelling is like it doesn't reach for black and white answers. It says that a lot of the stuff goes on in the spaces in between the conversations and the people and on the faces, and we see this play out in a kind of a non-dialogue drama in a way. And I do think that there's many ways you can think about the outcomes in the film, and some of it is, about our personal responsibility to each other. And I think, in the second time that Elizabeth sits with the parents, she's actually able to be present, like truly present, and she wasn't the first time. And so some of
Mm-hmm.
these shifts are kind of in tone and how we are present as opposed to necessarily what is said. So I found that really interesting to explore.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one thing I liked about it, which Tom said about there being no winners, it's real. Because if that happened in real life, that is probably how it would play out, you know? I mean,
Yeah.
it's sad, but it's true. Speaking of conversation starters, one thing Tom and I both noted, um, in the book and in the movie, the main character is Elizabeth Taylor, and we were just wondering if there was any reason behind picking that name. I mean, I know it's the name of the character in the book, but
It is, and I didn't challenge Carl on that because I trust him,
uh-huh.
and he chose that name, and I wanted to keep it because it was there, and I
Mhm.
see that people sometimes call her Beth.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we were like, "Huh, is there any relation to the actress?" Or just we didn't know if there was, like, a certain reason that that name was used because it's obviously a very iconic name, at least in the US, so
I
but that's
know,
cool.
yeah, and I didn't even ask Carl about that.
Mhm. I was gonna say it's
Mm.
kind of a risky choice because for me personally, as soon as I heard it, my brain stopped and think, why is her name the name of someone else who's famous?
Yeah, I know. It's so funny because Elizabeth Banks improvised when the father said, "What's your name again?" She goes, "Elizabeth Taylor," and then she went, "Like the actor."
Mhm.
That's awesome.
Does this taking place in New Zealand present any unique challenges or advantages? One, because I don't know the New Zealand healthcare system, how much it's like the US versus, versus New Zealand. So I feel like the story is kind of more universal because it's not about like the healthcare system so much, but about the medicine. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So our health system here is very different because we have a public health system, but we are very under resourced. Every day in the news, there's situations where we're talking about the waiting rooms and the emergency departments can last for an interminably long time, 12, 14 longer hours, and that there's just not enough doctors to um, attend to those who need help and nurses, and people are sort of in beds and corridors and things like that. So, the under resourcing and overwhelming need for good healthcare is probably a universal thing, but it's particularly acute here in New Zealand right now. And most people, well, many people wouldn't have health insurance because the public system's supposed to look after those who need it, and the waiting times are incredibly long, and it's something, of course, every government is trying to fix. But yes, it's same thing, the rural urban divide. There are many places in rural New Zealand where there are just not doctors on call. If you have a medical event, it's a long way to your nearest hospital. Um, so
Huh,
yeah.
that's interesting because yours is public, but ours is private, but we have a similar problem, but probably for different reasons.
Mm,
In the US, it's more about the insurance companies limiting how much they're willing to spend and wanting to maximize usage so that they don't have extra people standing around.
right.
Uh, Getting into my own little socio-political views on healthcare, but
Mm,
it's
sure.
interesting.
No, it is. Well, it's incredibly interesting, and I think some of these ethical issues are brought up in the film, like the kinds of choices that are made that you may not be aware of, and how perhaps you need to either advocate for your own healthcare or have someone advocate for you if you're not in that um,
Hmm.
position. And I think one. So circling back to a question you asked me earlier, is my particular interest in this story was not only because it's a fantastic book, but also because my partner experienced medical misadventure, and that really opened up my eyes to the medical system and the kinds of uh, mistakes that can happen, which have a cumulative effect over our chances of living or dying. And this kind of thing happens every day. Um, there's a lack of transparency and clarity over some of these decisions sometimes, and then there's just human error, of course. And I think one of the characters in the film is a ethicist, and he's talking about transparency and consent, and these kinds of issues are alive whichever health system you're in. um, there's a sort of a struggle over that. And as Elizabeth says in one of her scenes, she doesn't choose who she works on. They might be dying coming in. And then the ethicist says, well, maybe sometimes it's best not to operate. So there's this sort of No,
Mm,
we don't
right.
rate, we don't have public ratings of sort of surgeons' success or failure rates, as it were. But it does happen in some parts of the world, and that was something that Carl was speaking to in his novel. And I think that it raises all kinds of interesting political, uh, conversations about
Hmm.
healthcare.
Well, as someone who's had my own interesting medical experience, I understand that all too well.
Mm.
But this is certainly a conversation starter, a super interesting, compelling movie. Great job. Congratulations. What's next for the director, Jeffs, or writer Jeffs?
uh, Well, at the moment, I'm just bringing the film out into the world, but I'm really keen to do some more writing actually and tell another story. And recently had the pleasure of showing the film to an audience at the Tribeca Film Festival, and the programmer there turned to me at the end and said, "Please don't leave it so long till your next film." So I said I wouldn't. So
Hmm.
I'll wait until I feel passionate about another story, and then I'll be diving in.
Well, that's a great comment to get. Congratulations on that. Congratulations on the film. And
Thank
if you
you.
do have other films come out, definitely come back and see us again.
And thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to chat with you.
Oh, thanks for being here. Do check A Mistake in theaters now, or eventually. I'm sure it will appear on many streaming platforms. Otherwise, do follow us on at WG Therapy on X and Instagram, and writersgrouptherapy.com, where you can find all our episodes. See you next time.